Welcome to the second day of the Berlin Critics Week conference, Coherent Action, Incoherent Cinema. My name is Charlie Bendish. I'm part of the programming team of this conference. I feel very privileged to talk to you from a cinema. We are streaming straight out of the Hackschehöfe Kino, where we usually present our films and debates. This time, we had the opportunity to create our little studio here. Yesterday, on the first day of our conference, we already gained a lot of inspiring thoughts related to the terms coherence and incoherence, to their aesthetic and political dimensions. B. Will Be Rich talked about a consequential criticism and emphasized the idea of film criticism as social osmosis. Our first panel challenged the autonomy of art in criticism and described the pitfalls of terms like urgency. Later, Garrett Bradley and Kevin Jerome Everson discussed so many relevant topics that it is pretty difficult to condense them in a few words. So if you missed it, check out our YouTube channel in the next few days. After all these overwhelming analysis yesterday, we are now heading towards the future. We begin with a lecture by Arne Hendriks with the intriguing title, Shrinking Towards Abundance, Learning from Mad Science Hollywood. After the lecture, my colleague Petra is going to discuss with Arne Hendriks his method of speculative research. The closing panel of our conference is called Making Future Love Tonight, where we focus on how a positive futurity can be developed and demonstrated in theory and practice, in films, on the street, on the internet, or through any kind of collective resistance. Our guests on this panel are Kara Keeling, Janaína Oliveira, and Khaled Barake, and the discussion is moderated by the film and media scholar Julia B. I'm so happy that all of you are part of the Berlin Critics Week this year. Let's see if the future could be lovable in any way. If you have questions in relation to the two discussions, or comments or manifestos, check out our Telegram group. You find the link next to this video. We are going to collect the questions and hand them over to our moderators. Please also check out our film and debate program. The debates with wonderful guests are starting tomorrow, and you could already watch all the films. I hope all of you are as enthusiastic about this second day as I am. Thank you for joining us. And now I would like to pass the mic to Arne. I'm very curious about your lecture, and thank you again for being part of the Critics Week.
Thank you. Hello.
Hi, Arne.
Hello. Nice to meet you. I will just share my screen, share my sound. Is this clear for you now?
Yes.
Is it a full screen presentation now?
Not already. I think you have to make it full screen.
Of course. Sorry. All right.
Yes, perfect.
I would like to start with a video.
Yes.
In 1994, Rod Stewart gave a concert on Copacabana Beach. Why am I not able to move to the next slide? In 1994, Rod Stewart gave a concert on Copacabana Beach in Rio, and it turned out to be a legendary concert because between 4 and 5 million people showed up, making it the best attended concert in history. And between 4 and 5 million people is an interesting number because That is how many people were alive on the planet in 10,000 before Christ, at the dawn of the agricultural revolution. Just think, if Rod Stewart had given this concert in 10,000 before Christ, he would have had the entire human population right there in front of him. The rest of the planet would have been completely empty of people. Today, there are almost 8 billion of us. Every village of 1,000 people has turned into a city of 1.5 million. 1.5 million giants, because giants is what we are becoming. As you can see in the graph, in the middle of the 19th century, right there at the bottom, in the middle of the 19th century, the Dutch were among the shortest people in Europe. But this has rapidly changed. We are now the tallest people in the world. We became almost 20 centimeters taller, or that's 12% taller. On an evolutionary scale, this is unprecedented. Perhaps what is happening to us is the result of a Fisherian runaway. Ronald Fisher was a mathematical biologist with an interest in peafowl, and especially the male, the peacock, and especially its tail, the very tall peacock tail. He wondered why this tail had become so ridiculously tall. Why was it worth the investment of so much energy? And basically what he found was that peahen, the female, had reduced their entire assessment of the fitness of a peacock to the size of their tail. Bigger was better. Because if you are able to produce very tall feathers, this must mean you have some qualities. You have the qualities to do so. And it's true. It's what they call an honest signal in biology. The problem is that they don't really look at anything else. So in order to continue to be part of the gene pool, peacock have to invest more than healthy amounts of energy into their tall feathers, which in the end has detrimental effects on the overall fitness of the species. Since selection would prefer tall feathers over time, peafowl would either have longer tail feathers in males or a growing preference for them in females. If you stop investing in things like strength, intelligence, speed, even the ability to fly, then trouble is around the corner, obviously. So when I look in the mirror and I see almost 2 meters of human flesh, I understand you cannot really see that, but I'm almost 2 meters tall. I cannot help but wonder if this is a desirable sign of superior genes, or if in fact I am the materialization of a Fisherian runaway event. Has human height spun out of control, weakening us as a species? Are my painful knees and back trying to tell me something? Robert Wadlow, who you see here, trying to escape the advances of a small group of admiring women, died at the age of just 22 years old. At that moment, he was 2 meters, 72 centimeters, the tallest person in recorded history. He had a benign tumor in his pituitary gland in the back of his head, which caused the secretion of copious amounts of growth hormone. I mean, he was still growing when he died of an infected blister on his foot, given to him by the metal braces he needed to wear so he could walk. He didn't have the strength to fight the infection because he needed all his energy just to keep his heart pumping. Robert Wadlow manifests the truth behind giant-sized people. They're weak, not strong. Goliath never stood a chance against David. It was all symbol, without substance. Throughout the ages, stories like this, mixing up strength and size, have confused us. Our pride of tallness is a classic example of cause and effect confusion. Yes, the causes for our increased size are perhaps good food, good health, health insurance, a stable political climate, but the effects of all these causes is nothing to celebrate. Not for us as individuals, not for us as a species, and certainly not for our environment and practically all other forms of life. A few years ago, this famous chair was in the news because Petra, the company, Petra is actually in Germany, I think. The company that produces it, it's a famous chair by Ray and Charles Eames, you might know it. So Petra noticed that they weren't selling as many of these chairs as they used to. And they found out that it was because the chair had become too small for their customers. The chair was first made in 1957, and people have, of course, grown considerably since then. As a response to these slowing sales, the company decided to make the chair 10% bigger. The problem with that is that because of the laws of proportion, to make the chair 10% bigger, you need 33% more resources. It's 1.1 times 1.1 times 1.1 is 1.33. Even relatively small increases in height have considerable consequences. Yet, we continue to celebrate it, as if by some sort of cumulative default response, where we as a species always give higher marks to bigger and lower marks to smaller. And I want to share with you one of my favorite research videos by the renowned Karolinska Institute of Stockholm. What you see is an augmented reality video of what happens if we continue to grow taller, and then its obvious alternative. So what you see is he's making a kind of a psychological connection between the very tall legs that you see through this camera, that he sees through the goggles, through this camera. And then he presents an object in front of the camera and asks the subject how big this object is. And hopefully you can see that the object that is presented to him is a lot bigger than what he thinks. Here's the obvious alternative that I was talking about. Smaller legs. Similar psychological relationship being made between what he sees on the video and his own legs. So he feels actually that somebody's touching his leg, and that's how he's confused into sort of believing that those are his legs. And again, then an object is presented in front of the camera, and again, he is asked, how big is the object? Now, the Karolinska Institute actually is the same institute that gives out the Nobel Prize for physics. So they're not amateurs, although it looks kind of DIY, but that's also the beauty of it, I believe. And as you can see, he thinks the object is much bigger. And this is also why it's called the Barbie doll experiment, obviously, although I believe this is a Ken, not Barbie. Again, a connection is made, and the result should be obvious to you. What they proved for the first time scientifically, which is quite interesting, and this is the first time they proved that scientifically, is that as we continue to grow taller, the world is actually shrinking, not as a metaphor, but in reality. Not as a metaphor, but in reality. Our world is becoming smaller as we become taller. We need more. The Eames chair basically shows us, but we have less. That's what the Karolinska video showed us. Nobody shows us more clearly where this is going than Buster Keaton in a scene from the 1928 silent film, The High Sign. I don't think anybody explains the principles and the dangers of exponential growth better than he does in this very simple video, but brilliant as always when Buster Keaton does anything. This moment just before Buster falls, when the newspaper is still suspended in mid-air, is like the moment when Wile E. Coyote runs over the edge of the cliff and is momentarily suspended in air, a situation known as gravitational cognizance, where the character doesn't really fall until they realize they should be falling. A situation where the state of suspended disbelief allows Wile E. Coyote to hang on just for a second. I believe we as a species currently exist in this second. And the question is what we're going to do. We're clearly at a crucial point in our story here. I hope that the same space of suspended disbelief that is energizing our current belief in continuous growth, if inspired by other forms of storytelling, can become the space where we initiate the change. In 1967, two civil engineers, Robert Hansen and Miley Holly, wrote an article titled, "Is there a better human size?" This is one of the interesting illustrations that was part of that article. It's in the MIT Journal for Design. And they asked if we can afford not to consider the question of human size, now that increasing knowledge of genetics and endocrinology opened up the possibilities of interfering in human height. They argued that it appears more reasonable to consider a decrease rather than an increase in size, as an increase would clearly aggravate the problems we already associate with our excessive rate of population growth. And shrinking would, of course, alleviate the pressure we're putting on our planet. And indeed, if we look at the laws of proportion, individual size does seem to have a disproportional impact on our needs. It was a serious question by two serious guys. And of course, we can speculate about the origins of their ideas. It is quite probable that they were inspired by early science fiction in literature and art, where the reduction in size to understand the totality of a subject is of all ages. Basically, that's what artists do a lot, right? Sculptors, etc. They reduce something to understand what they are dealing with. Just think of the Pygmalion also in Greek mythology, or Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift, where shrinking allows him to zoom in on a completely different reality. For those who've read Gulliver's Travels, he uses words like a microscope to really zoom into very fine details of reality. It's wonderfully written. The first film I'm aware of where this sort of fantasy plays out is by Georges Méliès. I'm not entirely sure how I pronounce that name, Méliès, from 1901. And I think a few years later, in 1903, there was already the first version of Alice in Wonderland. I have a small clip here of this film by Méliès called The Dwarf and the Giant. It's just a short film, so we can see the whole thing. I can't help but wonder, when people saw this for the first time, you know, not being completely seasoned by film and by moving pictures, what this must have done to their fantasy. I mean, even for me, still looking at it is just beautiful, and there is magic to it somehow. But perhaps the more recent, bye-bye. But perhaps the more recent mad science films were more appropriate, were more important to keep this idea of a shrinking protagonist alive. Films like, I don't know, I mean, for me, even Attack of the Puppet People or The Devil Doll, and of course, The Incredible Shrinking Man, where technology is presented in a more abstract form of a cloud of radioactive particles. Most of these films were quite dystopian, and the scientists were mostly portrayed as cruel men. In fact, the act of shrinking fellow human beings became the very definition of cruelty within these films, which is why the 1967 article on considering human size was perhaps an act of bravery. Shrinking didn't have really good references, and it still doesn't. But to me, they recreated the space of suspended disbelief, because perhaps the current idea of continuous growth is more mad and disruptive than a mad professor with a nuclear bomb in his pocket. There's nothing mad about adaptation. Every 4 to 7 years, the El Nino weather event warms up the Pacific Ocean, and that causes a problem for these beautiful animals, the marine iguanas of the Galapagos Islands. The seaweed they eat, and you can see them eating it right here, doesn't like warm water, and it stops growing, which basically means that there is much less food available. At the same time, the warmer water speeds up their metabolism, which means they need to eat more to do the same things. So they need more, they have less. And so what they do is very logical. They shrink. Not just their muscles or skin, not just their soft tissues, everything shrinks, including their bones, through a process of recalcification. They shrink up to 20%. And this allows them to survive. This is actually called the Dennell phenomenon. August Dennell was a Polish biologist studying a species of small rodents, shrews, when he noticed that before winter arrived, their skulls became smaller, also 20%. They anticipated, which is even better than the marine iguanas to some extent, they anticipated food shortages in winter by already downsizing the organ that uses the most energy, which is their brain. And when more food is available in spring, the skull grows back. This isn't mad science, quite the opposite. It makes perfect sense. And it's not just animals that understand this. The Mbuti in northeast Congo are rarely over 145 centimeters tall. They secrete high levels of growth hormone, inhibiting hormone, basically telling their bodies not to grow. From a contemporary perspective, you could say that their DNA has incredible evolutionary intelligence and foresight. And basically, that's, of course, how DNA works, right? It responds to the environment and then expresses itself accordingly. But since we have created a cultural environment solely focused on growth, this natural ability is failing. And that's Wile E. Coyote's cliff. We're failing to adapt. Another one of my evolutionary heroes are the Laren people, of which there are maybe 200 or 300 in the entire world, just a few, but they grow only to be 130 centimeters tall. One of the incredible superpowers their bodies have, one of their adaptations, one could say, is that they don't get cancer, nor do they get diabetes, which makes perfect sense, considering these are the two most prominent illnesses in our current growth-obsessed society. And that's a game the Laren people obviously are not playing. And then, of course, you have supercentenarians, people that are over 110 years old. They're rarely taller than 160 centimeters, even during their younger years. And the smallest person that ever lived, Chandra Bardu Dangi, a goat herder from Nepal, he was just 54.6 centimeters, and he weighed around 12 kilograms. These are all people telling us different stories about us as a species, showing us other possibilities, other embodied desires. We don't need films or literature or art to show us that it's possible to shrink. This is a fact. But we need art in all its forms to open up a space to start imagining how these properties will become part of our reality, how to practice desiring it. Because at present, all our desire has been appropriated by the notion of growth. The Incredible Shrinking Man, both the film and my version of it, are attempts, consciously or unconsciously, to explore the space of alternatives to growth stories, to practice thinking about it, to practice feeling the desire, to create storytelling that will allow us to step away from the cliff's edge. The only way for Robert Wadlow, the tall peacock guy that I showed before, to have any chance at life, let alone flight, is to drastically reduce his size. And I, of course, don't have to explain to you who Robert Wadlow is. I would like to finish this short introduction to the reasoning behind Shrinking Man with something a little bit more practical, because I understand that such an exercise as this always contains the risk of becoming too abstract, too armchair, too gratuite in some ways. And so I just want to share a story from when I first visited the Japanese island of Okinawa a few years ago. I was welcomed there by a very small and elegant old lady, Miss Kuranari, and she immediately presented me with a wonderful miso soup with the clams and soba noodles and some seaweed and all that stuff. And then she said, "Hara hachibu." And when I explained I didn't speak Japanese, she put the fingers of her right hand on her left arm, and she took 2 steps. This is what she did. She just did this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then she took the 1 step back. And then she took 1 step back after these 5 steps. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then she took 1 step back and gave me this imaginary step. She just plucked it off her arm and gave it to me. Later, I learned that there's an image of it right there. Later, I learned that what she was telling me was quite literally, eat until you are 80% full. Hara hachibu. So don't eat until you're full, but eat until you are no longer hungry. And I'd become interested in Okinawa because people there actually are quite small. The older generation of Okinawans are on average below 150 centimeters tall. And they also have a very high life expectancy. the 20% space they give themselves by only eating until they're 80% full is the same 20% we saw before in the Daniel phenomenon. It is the space of adaptation. It is the space of suspended disbelief. But they do it because they want to do it. It is embedded within their culture. So I showed you in the beginning this sort of a rather silly choreography where I'm slowly shrinking, kind of a ritualistic opening of the space of suspended disbelief, I guess. In Okinawa, they have cultured a very practical translation of this space of suspended disbelief. And that's the 20% of Harachibu. But I guess it could also be applied to more than just eating. It's working 4 rather than 5 days. It's taking a bicycle or a train rather than a car. It's eating local foods. It's a step back from the cliff, allowing us to choose another reality. 11 years ago, I was inspired by the film The Incredible Shrinking Man, not because of the dystopian character of most of the film, not because it articulates the dangers of technology in the hands of the power-hungry, not because he defeats the spider, but because in between the lines, it created a space for other than growth stories, especially in the final sequence, where he lets go of his fear, and he embraces the prospect of an alternative reality. Let's listen to and look at that final sequence.
I was continuing to shrink, to become what? The infinitesimal? What was I? Still a human being? Or was I the man of the future? If there were other bursts of radiation, other clouds drifting across seas and continents, would other beings follow me into this vast new world? So close, the infinitesimal and the infinite. But suddenly I knew they were really the two ends of the same concept. The unbelievably small and the unbelievably vast eventually meet, like the closing of a gigantic circle. I looked up, as if somehow I would grasp the heavens, the universe, worlds beyond number, God's silver tapestry spread across the night. And in that moment, I knew the answer to the riddle of the infinite. I had thought in terms of man's own limited dimension. I had presumed upon nature that existence begins and ends is man's conception, not nature's. And I felt my body dwindling, melting, becoming nothing. My fears melted away, and in their place came acceptance. All this vast majesty of creation, it had to mean something. And then I meant something too. Yes, smaller than the smallest, I meant something too. To God, there is no zero. I still exist.
So, interesting. He asks, what was I? Still a human being, or was I the man of the future? Hopefully, we can agree to answer his question with a resounding yes. And rather than grow towards scarcity, shrink towards abundance. Harachibu. That's all, folks. Let me stop sharing.
Okay. Hello, Arne.
Hello.
And thank you very much for your very inspiring and very, at the same time, entertaining presentation. Just before we start, I would like to say hello to everybody out there on the screens and want you to give some information. As we mentioned before, we have a Telegram group, and after a few minutes, or about 10-15 minutes when we talk, Arne and me, you can post, well, you can already post some questions, and you can join our conversation and asking questions or making remarks, comments, or anything. So yes, yeah, thank you, Arne. And yeah, we talked a few weeks ago, and we already had our conversation about possible approaches towards the idea of size and growth. And for me, I think it's important to understand our relation to growth and size, is to understand how back in history, the meaning has changed in the evolution as well. So like you mentioned before, that growth wasn't all the time a very good moment for a being to be big. So you had this giant lizard, which actually becomes smaller. But in the human growth, there's something that we always have the need for being bigger, or to be big seems to be something that we are superior as well, maybe towards, not just towards the other human beings, but maybe as well towards the nature. So and as you mentioned as well, or as the Shrinking Man has already mentioned, Gaia, we could go back as well to Bruno Latour and his idea of Gaia, and us being part of this, what we always call nature as an opposite to us, so being actually part of the nature. So what would be actually the idea in the past, or regarding your position, what would you say would be the idea that there was this moment of growing, even though it's not really suitable or an advantage for us?
Let me just first explain that the fact that I am 2 meters, I see my body seriously as the materialization of a lot of bad ideas. I don't think that the human body is supposed to be this size. And so there is an extra 20 or 30 centimeters in the flesh right here that I always carry around with me, that I feel is the result of ideas that are destructive. And so when I'm looking at myself in the mirror, I'm trying to be sensitive to that destructive extra 30 or 20 centimeters. Depends, of course. You can say different things like that. At the moment, I think 150 centimeters would be a very beautiful sort of average size, to be honest. So this is how I go about my work. I'm not I'm an artist. I'm an artistic researcher. What I try to do is I try to enter into spaces that I'm interested in. I entered this space 11 years ago, where I'm not knowledgeable per se, where I don't know, where I'm not a person with control over information, but where I'm just trying to be one of all of us, where I'm trying to practice, where I'm trying to learn. And you know, if you just mentioned, for instance, Bruno Latour, I try to learn from him. I try to listen to what he has to say, and I try to see if I can actually put that into practice in my own life, if there are ways I can embrace his ideas. And so this is how I go about my work. It's, you know, the dance I showed you in the beginning, although it's a very silly dance, it's an honest dance. It is almost an act of frustration that I look at this mirror, there is no way I can, how can I deal with myself? How can I deal with the product of all those, in my vision, you know, not so great ideas? How can I deal with this obsession that is embodied within my flesh? How do I deal with it? So from sheer frustration, or one night in a rather cheap hotel room somewhere in Italy, I just did this dance. It was not something that I was actually at that moment willing to share. It was just, I wanted to see what happened. And then at some point I thought, hey, and so, you know, I know it looks silly, but it's also always an invitation to the other to say, hey, but what about this? What about this? I'm sort of, we are all in this together. So my work is very much an open space for debate and discussion, not somebody on a tower that has the knowledge to say, let's go in this direction, people. It is really is an open space. It is this space of suspended disbelief. So just for this moment, we're sort of hanging over the cliff. What can we do? Put all our stories, all our emotions, all the things that we can find. Let's put them together and let's try to bump out of this direction that we are going as a species at the moment. And we are pulling everything with us. That was not an answer to your question, but it was a first response.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I mean, I have a lot of connotations to the film as well, to the Shrinking Man, and especially now we can start from the end of your presentation. And when we think about the Shrinking Man, I mean, the Shrinking Man, when he actually goes into the as small as he is, into the vast, infinite world, for him, it seems to be like a sort of a liberation as well. So it's not something he's fearing at this certain point. And I think thinking about this, we could maybe talk about ideas and methods of imagining a world which could be more like not going into an expanded version of the world, into space, to expand into space, but maybe going back to a microcosmos and to be, or maybe even don't move so much as we do, especially what at the moment we don't move. Everybody doesn't move so much, but usually we do.
Not yet.
Yeah, not yet. So this might be ideas. So what, like you said, you have certain methods and you have certain ideas, and your research is speculative research. So what could be speculations as well, have aesthetics which could be useful to approach that? Or have you got as well ideas of examples which you could use apart from mad Hollywood science? Is there anything you would like to see?
I think Petra, you picked up on the most important thing about The Incredible Shrinking Man, and this is also how the film was able to start inspiring me, is that it actually has this last final sequence where all the fighting, all the dystopian ideas about a smaller person are sort of released. He lets it go. And he opens up and he like you said, you use the word liberation. Now, this is something that is quite rare in science fiction films. Often they choose a dystopian approach when they discuss the future. And you know, I was thinking a little bit about this, and perhaps it is that these science fiction films, they're functioning quite well to instill this kind of fear of change, because it always goes with a lot of violence, always at the cost of the individual. The protagonists in these films always have to go through all this terrible things. So it's almost as if these films from this dystopian angle create the fear for change. And I feel that somehow The Shrinking Man, it really opens up, and it says, it says, just wait for a moment. Do not yet say yes or no to this. Just wait for a moment. Just feel. And I feel that these final words, and they are not the exact words that were written in the book, because the film is based on a book by Richard Matheson. So you can also look up those words. They're also very nice. They're not exactly the ones, but I feel that somehow Jack Arnold, who was the director, I think he was actually very important in putting these words in this way. He really opens up a space for approaching the future with a new set of ideas. So not to fear it so much, but to be curious, to be enthusiastic almost. There's almost enthusiasm in his words, right? To just see what happens. And this is something that I like about, you know, and I think in a way that's quite disruptive, because most science fiction is not very, it doesn't really have this sense of, well, I wouldn't say it doesn't have the sense of adventure, but there is this dystopian. And this here you almost enter into a longing for that future, which I think is great. And I feel, and if you want to make it very practical, I do feel that we should become smaller towards the future. And that the only thing that could happen at some point is that we will become smaller, either because we choose to do so and we use our cultural tools to nurture, let's say, a culture of smallness, to start embracing it, to desire it, or we will at some point hit that wall that we can all see approaching really quickly. And then, situation will be so dire that we will also start to become smaller. One of these strange things, for instance, that the warming of our climate is already starting to shrink. Quite a large number of animal species around the world. Crustaceans are shrinking, birds are shrinking, fish are becoming smaller because of this metabolic rate situation, where they have to eat more in a warm climate to do the same thing. So what they have to do at some point, if they cannot eat more, they have to become smaller. So somehow the climate change, this hyper object, is already starting to affect us, but not us, but everything around us. All other forms of life are affected, but we have this cultural buffer still in place. But that cultural buffer at the moment is all about growth. So rather than shrink towards abundance, to embrace another set of ideas, our response to scarcity that we can feel all around us somehow, we can feel that there is, our soils are degrading, our air is polluted, all these kind of things that we always discuss. Our response by default is always to look for more growth. Of course, now, for instance, we talk a lot about green growth, right? But still growth. It should always be growth. We are somehow not able to step away from that idea that is so destructive to us. So I would say that if you want to speculate about the future, let's start speculating about less, but desired forms of less. I really like the 20% space that Hara Hachibu represents. You take one step back, 80%, not 100%, not more than 100%, 80%. It is not so scary to me. 80% is something I think, okay, I can do that. 80% is something that is attainable. No, go ahead.
I would like to ask you a question. What do you relate to abundance? So abundance would be for you what in this context?
Because it could be either. It could be an abundance of time. It could be an abundance of food. It could be all sorts of abundance. An abundance of clean air, an abundance of clean water, an abundance of all the things that we can have an abundance of when we stop pushing the borders constantly. Because we are really growing towards scarcity. I mean, it's this silly paradox that the harder you work, the less time you have to enjoy the fruits of your labor. Right? It's just it is a very simple thing, but somehow we have to continue to repeat these things to ourselves because we are somehow not doing it. We're not making a change. And so, for instance, the idea of green growth that is now very, very popular among managers and people in business and bankers and all this kind of stuff. I think it doesn't make any difference. It will still be about pushing the possible
growth. Yeah.
Green actually. No, go.
Now, are there any scientific researchers actually in the direction of shrinking the economy or shrinking as well, and by shrinking the economy, shrinking as well everything which would follow? I mean, everything could be as well in terms of not just the growth of the material world, but actually what you're proposing, that we as human beings have to shrink. So are there any scientific research at how this could be a method? I mean, scientists research a lot of things. So is there any serious idea about that the human being could be as well in the future could be
really smaller? Yes, there is. There are a few, but it's like a drop on a hot plate. But there, for instance, in California, you have Thomas Samaras, who's written 2 books about the ramifications of human size, and that it would be a lot better if we would become smaller and how we would go about it. I work with some of these scientists. I work together with them and we exchange stories, but they are just a few people. And of course, they are seen as the mad scientists, whereas everybody else basically is the mad scientists, right? It's like that, you know. There's a space engineer that I work with, Donald Platt, who actually did extensive research in how you could become smaller, because they're interested in sending small animals into space to Mars. That's why these astronaut people are working on that type of thing. What they want to do is send small cows and pigs and chicken to Mars, because it's very expensive to send fully grown ones. Every kilo costs like, I don't know, $10,000 to $20,000, and then to genetically unpack them once they get to Mars. And so they know already quite a lot about how to shrink. And of course, you know, it's not even. I mean, we can go into the, let's say, cutting edge science of this, but we don't need to. Just look at selective breeding. We have been breeding and making animals bigger, for instance, meat production, like cows and bulls. We've been breeding them to become bigger and bigger and bigger. So of course, the obvious thing is that they could also become smaller. It is just that they have also become, like our bodies, the materialization of our desire for always more. And that desire is manifesting itself in all sorts of ways. You've just mentioned, for instance, the economy. There is, of course, the degrowth movement in the economy. There are people trying to come up with other alternative economic systems. You have Kate Raworth with her donut model. You have, of course, Fritz Schumacher, who was who wrote the very important book Small is Beautiful, where he also dissects current economic models. You have Claire Brown, who actually embraced Schumacher's idea of Buddhist economics, where it is not about where the sort of the central idea is that a good system is where you use the least to accomplish the most. And that's, of course, not part of our economy. We just have to spend. That's the best for everybody in the current economy. So there are, in all sorts of ways, in every field imaginable, there is knowledge out there. There are stories available. There are people that want to create that alternative reality. It is just that we have to start listening to them. We have to start sharing their stories. We have to put those stories together. I mean, the Incredible Shrinking Man has basically become a kind of a reservoir for other people in the know. You know, so if you go to that website, you will find so many different stories, sometimes funny, like you said, sometimes entertaining, but also sometimes serious about economy. I spent half a year as an artist in residence at a cancer research institute to understand what we can learn from malignant growth and how a cancer cell develops into something that destroys the system. You know, a lot of people would say the economy is behaving similarly. So if that is true, then what can we learn from cancer researchers, right? 2 years ago, I was at a bank. So I try to go to the places where growth or shrinking are important. So I was at a bank and I did more than a year of research within the bank into growth and shrinking and how they can embrace other models. It's very difficult, of course, because banks are based on interest. And to create interest, you need to grow. Otherwise, there is no interest. So they are in a kind of a crisis, but they are curious. So there is a chance, there is an opening, there is curiosity. But more and more people have to somehow jump into that second of Wile E. Coyote hanging over the cliff. We have to be present in that second, and we have to find ways to step back to the cliff. That's yeah.
Actually, I got here a question already related to what you said just now, and therefore, Junia, she asked. She would like to ask you if you see if what you just lectured as a criticism to capitalism, but you didn't use this term. So, but she interpreted that it is like this, and if he sees that if you see that the tallest population nowadays in Europe, or you say Canada, and if you see the relation to the way they consume more, but don't accommodate the biggest population of the world, maybe less than 1 billion. Sorry, I didn't understand the question, did you?
Well, maybe that's,
so,
okay, maybe for instance,
sorry,
India. What is the question?
Yeah,
I don't know if
maybe
I can see. Maybe I can go to the chat and see it myself.
No, you can't. So I just read it again. Sorry about that. I would like to ask Arne if he sees what he just lectured as a criticism to capitalism. I don't think he used this term, but I interpret it like this. And if he sees that the tallest population nowadays are in Europe or USA and Canada, and if he sees the relation to the way they consume more but don't accommodate the biggest population of the world, maybe less than 1 billion.
So should I just start somewhere? Like,
yes,
for instance,
please start.
Is this a criticism to capitalism? Yes.
Yes, I think this was the center of the question.
Capitalism is a deeply sick system that is completely destroying everything that we love. It is all about winner takes all, zero-sum game, and it's getting worse and worse every second that we allow the system to be in place. There's just no way about, there's no other way I can say it. Of course, hidden or somehow not hidden, because you immediately picked up, there is a criticism of capitalism, but there is also the mirror that I'm looking into and understanding that actually, capitalism has served me well over the backs, of course, of a lot of other people, like maybe the billion people in China or India or whatever. So yes, there is a criticism there, and at the same time, criticizing the system, of course, that's one thing. But what I'm trying to do is, from my own position as an artist or an artistic researcher, is open up spaces where we can find alternatives to this, because it seems very, very, very difficult. For instance, even I'm in regular touch with people from the degrowth movement. Even within the degrowth movement, it is a very, very tough battle, and these are top economists, top philosophers looking for the other ways. And so I just continue to open up spaces where we can discuss, where we can meet, where we can feel inspired, where we can hopefully come up with other stories than this capitalist story. But it's not just about capitalism. It is about this entire desire for more and growth that is part of, yes, capitalism, but also maybe part of our nature in some ways. And then if it's part of our nature, then I'm hopeful for culture, maybe to start playing a role in how to deal with that biological urge for more that is part of our genes somehow. That's also why these evolutionary heroes like the Mbuti and the Laren are so important to me. There are many, many other examples I could have mentioned. The Homo floresiensis on the island of Flores in Indonesia, that were just 1 meter tall, but became extinct a long time ago. So many other interesting stories out there that do not take enough space. They do not take enough space in our storytelling, because the dominant.
So maybe it's as well, yeah. So maybe this is as well a question about how we approach the non-human beings and what kind of relation we have to them. Wouldn't you agree there as well?
Well, the relation is still quite clear. If you look at what the dominant culture, they are here to serve us. It's this old Judeo-Christian idea where they are here to serve us, and people like Donna Haraway or something are now creating a language and teaching us to now maybe learn to live and work together with them, to be part of the same, to try to think in a much more non-hierarchical way, or to design non-hierarchical practices when it is about animals. I mean, this whole idea of domestication in itself has become deeply problematic. By domesticating, there's also this idea of 10,000 before Christ, the moment when we let's say, adopted agriculture as our system, when we started to basically invent agricultural systems and pastoralism, etc., etc. This explosion of all these people started to take place, and we became, of course, completely dependent on agriculture. We cannot go without it anymore. And so our cohabitation with it's just silly. We are that other. We are that other species. We know there is. We have our micro God. We are connected in so many different ways, and we are behaving so silly, so immature. There's this animal in Suriname that I love. It's called the paradoxical frog, and I just love it because of the idea of maturity. The interesting thing about the paradoxical frog is that the tadpole is this size, really this size. It's a very big tadpole, but the mature frog is only this size. I think we are sort of the eternal tadpole here, and it's really time that we become the mature frog. I think what we should try to desire is to finally become mature in relation to our environment. and stop behaving like these adolescent idiots, basically. And
well,
yeah.
Well, I've got another question here as well from Dennis, and I would like to ask Anna, how about shrinking an experience of art, reducing a film in its dimension and shrinking it down to a display, and human beings shrunk to the size of a display through Zoom? This is a very immediate form of shrinking happening right now, and we're all concerned with it. What thoughts do these shrinking spark in you? Currently, you are 3 centimeters high on his display, he said. So what are your thoughts about that? So
yeah, it's interesting. You know, it would be interesting to ask all those other species what they think of it. Now that we stopped moving around, flying around the earth, you know, going out there, and what this kind of shrinking, this sort of forced modesty of our species in some ways, what it means to them. You know, I have to say, Dennis, you know, I think it's an interesting exercise in modesty somehow. But you feel and you see in the news, and we are in a very critical state right now, right? In the Netherlands, in Germany, people are becoming, we cannot deal with this. We cannot deal with the 3 centimeter us. It is just beneath us somehow. That's one way of answering it, I guess.
But what would be an aesthetics of an utopia then? And if we bring up the notion of utopia, which had become very out of fashion, let's say, in the last 40 years, but maybe you can bring it up again. And what would be an aesthetics of utopia as well, in regarding a smaller world?
Well, you know,
for the future?
Makes me think of, this question makes me think of Richard Feynman. He was a very famous physicist and philosopher. And in 1958 or 59, he wrote a paper called "There's Plenty of Room at the Bottom." It was interesting because physicists were all looking at the stars and they're trying to explain the big movements of the universe, and you know, and this whole desire for going there was basically born well before, but really got into a sort of a movement in the 50s. And he wrote this text, and it was, "There's plenty of room at the bottom." And basically what he said is, don't look at the stars, look at what's right there in front of you. There is so much to discover right here in front of you. So if you ask me this very direct question, what would be an aesthetics? The zoom. If you read Gulliver's Travels, there's your aesthetics for the future right there. What happens when the protagonist goes to Brobignac, this other place? Not when he's in this Lilliputian where he's very big, but when he's the small one and the other characters in the book are the giants. He describes incredibly what he sees right there, because he has shrunk down and he is there. At some point, he, for instance, describes a nurse's breast. You have to look it up. It's just amazing. It is an adventure. You know, we don't have to get in an airplane to the other side of the world to have an adventure, but we lost somehow the ability to have an adventure in our own backyard. And so trying to think about what it means to have an adventure in your own backyard. What does that actually mean? What is going on right there? If you have a backyard, you're already a lucky one, I suppose. But two, you know, I'm just speculating here because I wasn't, you know, I also don't know. But I would feel that this smaller world that has more depth somehow, so closer by but deeper, more knowledge of that little few square meters that you have right in front of you. You know, I don't know if you like diving. I used to like diving when I was still able to fly around the world, but that's a long time ago. I don't do that anymore now anyway. And there's always guys that all want to see the sharks and the big turtles. And already from the very first moment, I was the one who would just like to sit down in one place and just look at the smallest things right there. The nudibranches, the algae, the beautiful little things, you know? They would not even see it because we lost the ability. So I think an aesthetics would be that aesthetics. It's the microscope. It's the lens. There's so much right here. So Richard Feynman, I have a tabletop version. I did a choreography called the Feynman Zoom. And I didn't put it in my presentation, and I cannot really do it here because the screen is too small, but I have a tabletop version, and it basically goes like this. I don't know, look at. So there's an aesthetics for you. The aesthetics of this is the aesthetics that you're looking for, I would say, rather than.
So holding the things in your hand and instead of grasping them.
Yeah, taking care.
Yeah.
And then being appreciative of what's right there in front of you and learning. And if you cannot be appreciative, if you're looking at it, you're like, yeah, all this, why can you not be appreciative of these things? Why is the wonder of that whatever is in front of you, why is it smaller than the thing that is far away? You have to ask yourself these questions. This is the time to ask ourselves, all of us, why are we so uneducated in enjoying these small things?
I think this was really very inspiring, not just for me as well, hopefully for our audience, and maybe to all the questions which had been raised here towards future of the world, future of the people on this planet. We have maybe some questions in our next panel, and therefore I think it's a quite good contextual transition to it. So Arne, I thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you very much for your ideas you shared with me here at this conversation. And
thank you, Petra.
Yeah,
and everybody.
And I hope you will stay for the next panel, and we
I will
talk to you soon then.
Okay, talk to you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye, Arne.
Bye.
Bye. So how do we need to change approaching the world? We will discover this likely in our next panel, Making Future Love Tonight. I welcome Kara Keeling, who will join us from Chicago. Kara Keeling is Professor of Cinema and Media Studies at the University of Chicago. Her latest book is called Queer Times, Black Futures, and she's the author of several more. Janaína Oliveira from Brazil. Janaína is film history researcher and programmer and worked for several festivals, and also is the founder and coordinator of FICINE, Black Cinema Itinerant Forum, an international network for capacity building and discussion forum on Black audiovisual and photographic production. And Khaled Barakeh. Khaled is a Berlin-based conceptual artist and culture activist, and approaches creative practice as a tool for societal change, manipulating commonplace visual and cultural touchstones to expose and undermine stagnant power structures. And Julia B. is junior professor for image theory at Bauhaus University in Weimar, and currently MacArthur Fellow at University of Siegen. Her fields of expertise include theory of fact, visual anthropology and image-based research practices, gender and media, Anthropocene and film, as well as bicycling, activism and media. One of her latest publications is Filming Through the Milieu, Becoming Extinct and the Anthropocene. So we had been right here at the talk with Arne. Julia will moderate the next conversation, and thank you for that, Julia. And have a promising and intriguing evening. And we're looking forward to the future, making future love tonight.
Thank you, Petra. I hope you can hear me. Okay, with hearing? Yes, thank you. So thank you, Petra. Thank you, Critic Sweep. A very warm welcome to our guests in the virtual panel and to the audience out there. And welcome to the closing panel of the opening conference on Coherent Action and Incoherent Cinema. And this panel has the title Making Future Love Tonight. And this is a songline by the Dutch group Grupo Sportivo, brought up by Petra. And it is about loving an alien that landed on Earth coincidentally. And I believe for the critics, the crew, the programmer, this song line that gave the panel its name is hinting to science fiction, to a desire for another future and towards speculation. So let us talk now about practices, techniques and methods of performing the future, about acting, solidaric, and maybe a bit about utopia. But let us also talk about the power in the word future and the power that this word always bears with it, and the modes of counterpower in arts academia and curation, and hopefully beyond. And to the audiences, as in the other panels, you can type your questions in the Telegram chat, and you find the link in the YouTube channel under the live stream, and I'm happy to take them. Maybe we start with a few questions I prepared and then go further into your questions. And our guests tonight in this panel are from very different fields, which is very exciting: arts, curation, programming, and film critique. And they all are experts on questions of future and consequent action. And they all combine in their work committed action, thinking, and forms of collaboration. And I'm very happy to welcome Kara Keeling, Janaína Oliveira, and Khaled Barakeh tonight. And our guests are zooming in, as Petra said, from Berlin, from Rio and Chicago, being in very different time zones. And great, and thank you again that you could make it. And I'm extremely happy hosting such a great group of committed and rigorous scholars and artists. And at this point, I wanted to introduce you, which Petra already did, but maybe with a few other details. And I think the audience cannot get enough from all your great work. So again, Kara Keeling is a professor in the Department of Cinema and Media Studies at the University of Chicago. And among her rich body of work, which Petra already mentioned, she combines queer and Black theory with the analysis of film and media. And she's very well known for her work on Afrofuturism, and I warmly highly recommend, suggest reading all her work, especially her recent book, Queer Times, Black Futures on That Matter, that fits very well to that panel from 2019. And I hope we can talk a bit about that book. And Janaína Oliveira works as a film historian, film critique, and curator at the Federal Institute at Rio de Janeiro. And Janaína is one of the key figures in programming Afro-Brazilian film. She published widely on film and the strategies and development of exhibiting film, and especially Afro-Brazilian films. And in her work, which I find very interesting and want to hear more about, she combines series by Fred Moten, Stefano Hane, as well as Denise Ferreira da Silva with philosophy of exhibition, and she develops concepts of curation that are very relevant to questions of futurity. And I'm looking forward to talk about your work and also the combination of theory and practice. And last but not least, welcome Khaled Barakeh, who's, as Petra said, based in Berlin as artist and activist. And he's mainly dealing with photography installation, also in public spaces. And I want to mention a recent installation from 2020, which was created in front of the higher regional court in Koblenz, where the first international trial on torture in the Syrian regime was held, as well as other conceptual forms. And this work I was just mentioning is called Mute. His work is shown internationally, receiving great attention, and his work is in several exhibitions right now. Amongst one is Studio Bergheim right now. And he's the founder of the network Co-Culture since 2017, in which he brings together and supports displaced artists and cultural workers. And this work is facilitating artists and helping them to take into account, or taking into account the specific situation being an artist in a new environment. I would love to hear more about your artistic and activist work tonight and the role of collaborations. And we met before and you brought up a very interesting notion. Maybe we can come back to that later, in which you called your own work a practice of necessity. So you all work in very, very different but yet related fields, having also multiple practices. And I want to start by a first round by inviting you to share a bit more about your individual work, from the background of your different fields. And I would love to start with Kara. And I found something on your website that I find very interesting in relation to this panel, in which you describe that you explore the role of cinematic images and the construction and maintenance of hegemonic conceptions of the world. And you interrogate the complex relationship between cinematic visibility, minority politics, and the labor required to create and maintain alternative organizations of social life. And I want to ask you, can you explain maybe a bit more about how your work, also your theoretical work as a scholar in this field, and how you understand your work as film scholar in the maintenance and supportance of alternative organizations of social life?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. And it's really, I'm really excited about this conversation. I'm excited to hear about the other participants' work as well. And I appreciate the question about, my own work. I think the description that you read is most specific to the first book that I wrote, which is called The Witch's Flight, The Cinematic, the Black Femme, and the Image of Common Sense. And in that book, one of the things that I was trying to think through is how, there's a way in which people, even just in common parlance, in a way of speaking, say that they want to make certain things visible. And one of the initial questions that I had were, what are the parameters and constraints that already attend the realm of the visible? So the way that I started to think through that was to say that there's something about in the image that our usual way of perceiving images is to sort of think them through what's already common sense. And so images tend to just sink to common sense because there's a lot in an image. And when we perceive an image, we perceive it through a process of subtraction, right? So we subtract all the things in the image that maybe don't interest us in that moment. So I was interested in thinking about how filmmakers in particular can sort of break through these cliches or work with the cliches in order to bring out what's available in the image, but maybe not necessarily immediately perceptible in any image. So that's part of how I started thinking about how images are participating in the construction and maintenance of what I was talking about them, and then in terms of hegemony, right? So one of the challenges I think that filmmakers who are interested in doing work that breaks open different ways of thinking, different ways of perceiving, feeling the world, and in my next book that really became focused on, in terms of queer times, Black futures, that really became focused on this sort of possibility of perceiving this other world that's already sort of there, that's being generated. So I think for me, then across those two books, one of the concerns has really been to think seriously about the role of sound and vision in particular in maintaining the existing relation of things.
Thank you very much. I want to come back to that later on, but first maybe give Janaína also the opportunity to talk a bit about her work. And I would love to hear a bit about how you work with theory and practice, and what are the topics for you that need to be addressed consequently for you right now, and how far you respond to them in your work already.
Wow. So thank you, Julia. And first, I would like to say how happy I am to be here with you this afternoon for me here in Rio. I'm a huge admirer and fan of Carol's work. She's a reference, and so it's a pleasure to be here. And I'm also very happy to know Caleb's work. And so this was a great opportunity also to expand a little bit, my horizons. how do I connect? Well, maybe I should start how I understand or how I became a programmer and how, this developed. It's not going to be a very long story, but, because I started programming because after a few years doing research on Black Brazilian films and African films, I developed a kind of expertise here in Brazil. And then I started programming African films here and also Afro-Brazilian films abroad, and doing a kind of bridge, pretty much inspired by the work of Zózimo Bubu, that is, we can consider as the founding father of Black Brazilian cinema, not because he was the first Black filmmaker, but about his gesture, not with his film in 1973 called Soul in the Eye, but also creating what is, for a while, the most important Black film festival here in Brazil. I would dare to say in Latin America and Caribbean area. That's Encontro de Cinema Negro Zózimo Bubu, that we can Zózimo Bubu Black Film Festival. It was named after him after he passed in 2013. And he started this when he was 70. And I started my career with film because I'm a historian by formation and a teacher. That's what I do for a living. And my history of film starts, pretty much related to his work and how invisible was his work, mainly the festival, because for me, I don't consider myself a cinephile, but I always, I was always been interested in African films, and it was, not always so easy to watch things online. Even internet was not there yet. And he created this kind of, maroon community, as he called, but we can say this center place here in Brazil where it was possible not only to watch the films, but to meet the filmmakers, the African filmmakers and other diaspora filmmakers. And it was so invisible that somehow I start, my life trying to understand what is Black films, the reception, and that's how I start thinking more, taking more time to think about not only the film history, but how people elaborate on that. And for me, the first thing that came to my mind when I started working, because I came from my background in history, in theory. So that's how somehow I think. So I don't think that this division between practice and theory is something, is too Eurocentric. So I'm really thinking another way. So thinking about theory is part of my practice. So I took a long time to understand that the traditional film canon was not connected to the images that I was interested in. So, I was making a lot of effort to understand things through those lenses. So let's put it this way. So that's how I start thinking about other reference to think about the images, and they were not in the traditional film canon, let's say. We have this conversation that was published at another gays magazine, Towards a Quilombo Cinema, with other film critics and filmmakers from Brazil. And we explore a little bit this turn and how we can think about that. So I understood that we need to make a kind of what I call epistemological displacement. It's more kind of an invitation to use other reference to think about the images that I'm interested in, and not make those huge effort to use the traditional canon. That's how you mentioned in the beginning some references that come from the U.S. as Fred Moulton and Stephen Harney, and I mentioned Kara. There's other film scholars related to film in the US that are important to my work, but also you mentioned Denise Ferreira da Silva, that's a Brazilian philosopher and filmmaker, and I don't know, artist, and person. That's also important. But also, I'm also interested to work with my colleagues here, and in the visual artist Jota Mombasa, that's also important. And for me, just to name a few, even Tatiana Carvalho Corsa, that works with the idea of Quilombo cinema. Anyway, but this idea of this epistemological displacement is to find another way to approach film, because at the very end, what I'm interested in is a different kind of film culture, where other subjects, or subjects is not a good word, because I'm not interested in more in this relationship between subjects and objects, or using this, but other characters are present, and not only on the screen, in the screen, but behind the cameras, and also in the audience, and also producing reflections on that. I didn't mention, but for example, that's how I came up the idea. I'm programming the Fired Film Seminar this year, and my curatorial statement, it's called Opacity, and it's of course inspired by the Martinican philosopher, poet, intellectual Edouard Glissant, ideas of opacity. So all these things together, like a little bit of mosaic, it's shaping my interest, and it's how I'm been driving my work as a programmer, creating this dialogue. I don't know if it was clear, but I think, as we keep on talking, I can be more specific about it.
Thank you so much. It already resonates a lot with Kara's work, and the politics of epistemology, and the politics of canon and reference. We have to talk about this. You brought up very, very important questions to this topic of the consequence. But let's hear a bit about Khaled, and maybe you can tell us also a bit about your recent project, and especially the way you work, and in which way I wanted to ask, does your artistic and activist work deals with consequences, and how would you describe the relation of the political and aesthetic consequence in your work? And just for the audience, for example, I referred to your work with bureaucratic power structures in forced flight and the dehumanization in torture in Syria, as well as through objectification and datification of people. In the work After Images, your work After Images, self-portrait as a power structure, or I Haven't Slept for a Century. And you also touch on the fragility and volatility of human lives and things, for example, in your work On the Ropes. So maybe this is also a way, you deal with way of altering or inflecting or suspending even consequences and powerful implication of consequence.
Thank you so much, first, for inviting me and for moderating the session. I'm very happy also to be among Kara and Janina, and very nice to be in the same panel with you guys and hear your very rich contribution to this topic. So to give maybe a little bit perspective or background about my practice, I'm an artist, studied in Syria, mainly classical painting and drawing. Then when I moved to Europe, kind of my practice shifted with me, where I started learning about conceptual art. I started practicing conceptual art mainly, and then after this 2011, the revolution started before it turned into a war or a proxy war, and that kind of suggest a new way of thinking to deal with all of this big tragedy. So all of a sudden, my role started being shifting as well from an activist or social media activist sometime to investigator about some specific topics, or sometimes curating shows or teaching here at the Art Academy or facilitating workshops. At the same time, I founded, as you mentioned, a nonprofit organization called Co-Culture that has several projects. the most important ones of the project. It's called Syria Cultural Index. It's an online platform, aims to map, reconnect, and empower the Syrian artists and art practitioners all over the world. So kind of rebuild the community online, since our community is many communities now, since we don't have one group you call Syrian anymore, because you have the Syrian German, Syrian Jordanian, Syrian, Turkish, etc. So, and we're thinking, how can we reconnect the cultural scene again, understand where we are, understand what we do, and build a program based on statistic, not only based on expectation about our needs. The second project we thought of when we know more about who we are and what we do, that will help us to move to the second project and plan better a Syrian Biennale. And the idea of the Biennale is to, it will be a mobile Biennale that will follow the refugee route. So every edition will take a place in a new country. The third project, just to mention it very quickly, then I'm done with explaining a little bit about co-culture and shift to my personal artistic practice. We also have a program called Support the Supporters. The program basically aims to two things. First of all, help artists under threat to be relocated to Germany or to neighbor countries, or helping artists and or supporting, I don't like the word, supporting artists under threat, or if they are facing difficult times. Specifically, as you mentioned, we focus on artists in exile, but also working with Syrian artists wherever they are. The last project is, there's a project for now, it's called mentorship. I don't like the title, but the idea, it's very similar to the creation of co-culture. A lot of people arrived here, they have a lot of amazing ideas, they don't know how to implement it, they're just confronted with a lot of bureaucracy, and you have to learn more, like a lot about the country before being able to do your project. So what we do, you come to us with an idea, and then we discuss it with you, we sharpen it, we reflect on it, we help you in writing it in a budget, in a project proposal and budget breakdown, and our fundraiser try to help you to find fund for it, to impact or to maximize the social impact. And the last project is actually a space here in Berlin, and Wedding, for those who know Berlin. And we have the event space to host a variety of projects, from film screening to exhibition. We are hosting now an exhibition even during the lockdown of a Syrian artist called Amr Al-Akil. And even like people can't visit the exhibition, we decided to go for it because we believe we should maintain the artist work. So this is a very quick introduction of co-culture. The last thing to mention also about the space, it's a community curation. So we don't even want to impose our topics. We want people actually to come to us with topics, and we help them to do their events in the space. And the whole idea is for me at least, is form of decolonization, in a sense of redefining our needs from our own perspective as a community. Not necessarily we have to go through all the time a Western institution who want to present us or support us financially or this or that. So we actually define what we want, what the topics that matters for us, and then moving from there to do these projects. And this is kind of the mainly what I do with co-culture, or what we do here at co-culture. So back to the practice of necessity, all of this, I mean, it's an institutional work, but for me, I think of it as a form of art practice, as a studio art practice. To be honest, I'm a little bit, I don't know what's the right word. I don't want to say bored of the art world in an institutional way, but I'm not that interested anymore. I was part of it for quite some time, and I mean, I was never interested in the art market in general, but in the art presentation in a white cube, it's a little bit, I wouldn't say outdated, because now we live in a different reality where the urgency level is so high, and I really believe that we have to think critically as an artist. Institution has to think critically and change their role as well, to have this horizontal solidarity and understand the intersectionality as well of the topics. While you mentioned, for example, at the beginning that the three of us is coming from different, fields and backgrounds, I see so much connection at the same time, in a more subtle way, and maybe not directly, but really I believe so much in intersectionality in general. So yeah, so maybe I will stop here and maybe mention very quickly that I'm not curator. I don't want ever to be a curator. I use curation as well as an artistic practice. I'm not, you in the introduction, you said I'm focusing on photography. I don't actually. What I love about conceptual art that you can do anything you want in any form, in any format. So I never try to be in one section, just because I think the urgency again suggests every time new creative solutions and to be dealt with. One of the things which is connected to what Kyra was talking about, also the image and the representation for image. We have different situation, but in a different sense where we, I think as Syrians, we were confronted with the flood of images, and most of the time graphic images, and we were thinking how to deal with this, how to represent it, what is the ethicality of representing the victims vs presenting a conflict, right? Because on one hand, you want to protect the victims or their families mainly, and at the same time, you want to make advocacy for a cause. So you have to show these images, and that creates a lot of dilemma in this sense. I'm trying to, because so I will stop now. You asked me a lot of questions in one paragraph, so I will stop here and then continue maybe later to give space also for Kyra and Janina. Thank you.
Since you already addressed, Kyra, you wanna answer? If you...
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think kind of what you said to me also really resonates, because I think there's a way that there's a different but I think related issue around images of violence against Black Americans in particular, in the way that they circulate, especially on social media. And so I think part of one of the artists who has interested me in terms of addressing that has been Arthur Jaffa's work, in particular his Love is the Message is Death, which I think sort of really works to recontextualize those images, so that the way that we have just become accustomed to receiving them as just sort of part of the normal condition of the world can actually be given a different power, where they become sort of evidence of a broader a longer narrative about Black American struggle, Black American freedom, and Black American life. And so I think there's a way that the challenge that you identified in terms of the graphic images of violence is something that's also sort of part of our kind of everyday. And so for me, it's been really a question in terms of Black American, violence against Black Americans to sit with the way that those images can still do a certain kind of work, even though historically they've actually in many ways been celebrated as evidence of white supremacy. So for example, there are books that collect images of lynchings, where there would be sort of a lot of white people sitting around, eating, laughing, celebrating with a body hanging from a tree. So I think that kind of investment in the aesthetics of violence against Black bodies does a certain kind of political work that I think it's incumbent upon filmmakers, but also critics, to sort of begin to identify a different kind of epistemology and a different practice for trying to address the way that those images are used, and perhaps put them into different contexts, into different narratives or stories or ways of perceiving them and the horror that's in them.
Can I add something on that? Okay. Yes, yes, I do agree with you, Caleb and Cara, and with about the how our works are connected and how they are related. I was thinking when you start talking, Caleb, about this collective dimension and this urgency of building network and how this is something, because this, for me, maybe this is some very different from the US reality, and this how historically, you know, just let's keep it black, to black folks, you know, constitutes their history, and this pretty much different, for example, from the Brazilian experience. So even though we are the majority of the population, in terms of culture or a film culture, a network was something that we needed to build, for example. So it was not there because the images are the same images in terms of the violence. And it's not only the images themselves, but how they were framed and replicated and absorbed. I have serious doubts about if we need those images. I think, you know, they are not, I'm talking, of course, about my Brazilian experience, now sad experience, and because they really don't, you know, they are not effective anymore. People are just used it to, you know, they got used to violence and to see violence. And I think they do more work perpetuating trauma than working against it. You know, it's more like when I remember Grada Quilomba says what's pretty much connected to Jaffa's work and everything that is in there, Sadia's, Hartman's, and Fred Moulton's reflections about how trauma is not past, it's actual, and it's updated every time we screen and we see and we show those images. So and that's, for me, it has to do with my reflections as a programmer, you know, because film programs for non-hegemonic people, that means non-white, male, Eurocentric person, that means that your programming is much more a kind of, because curating has to do with etymological origins, is healing. But for me, it has to do more with trauma than healing. So, and so how we change this to more the sense that's also connected to the roots of the word, to care, to take care of, not take care in the sense how we take care not only of the images, but of those who are watching. I think, you know, not being, you know, putting very high the place of program. It's much more the other way around. It's trying to decolonize this place and to understand that trauma is something historically central in this job, let's say like this, related to the canon. So, and that has to do with those images of violence. And I'm not talking only about, you know, delacerated bodies. I'm talking about different levels of violence that are perpetuated through images, because it's not that open and explicit thing that we are talking about. We are talking about different ways of showing those levels of violence. So yeah, for me, somehow, you know, related to our topic here, to the future, this is one of the starting points to recognize this, how those practices are related to trauma and they are perpetuating trauma. So this is a first step for me in my work. So then we will move forward to other things. So that's how I see somehow, you know, our connections here. Yeah, just thinking out loud. Don't know if it makes any sense at all.
Yeah, it does make sense a lot. And sorry, Julia, just to say quickly, I completely hear you and I'm with you, because I think protecting people's dignity, and it's also, you can see this so much in the West and other part of the world, when the victims are West or Western or white, you don't see this violence, or, you know, it's all the time blurred or pixelated or whatever, while our suffering, our pain, it's exposed. And it has, I don't want to turn this panel about image representation, because that's, I think we can talk a week about it and it's not enough. But I see also, that's what I want to say as well. I just want to say one sentence, that I see also on the other side, when we talk about advocacy, we all know how images change the world, right? Like the Vietnamese naked girl, I forget his name, the photographer. Yeah, but I think you know one, the very famous, iconic one, the image of Ilan Kurdi as well, like when that had changed completely the whole situation, where Europe opened its arms for 1 million refugees to enter, etc., etc. So while can one, of course, talk about humanization or dehumanization, I think we should keep, and this is the struggle, at least for me personally, right? Where we should do this, or I mean, I try to come up all the time with the creative solution as at least through my practice, where I don't show victims at all. I show traces of victims that kind of lead to know the stories in a softer way. Yeah, but let's go back to the topic of the panel as well. Yeah, so.
But this is exactly the topic of the panel, because it all, right. I mean, most of all, it's your panel. So if you want to tell us more about your work in working with traces of victims, please do. I mean, it's really interesting and important work.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So basically, I think it was a decision I had to make when the revolution started, when it was still a revolution for almost 1 year. For those who sometimes get surprised by me using the word Syrian revolution, because everyone now think about it as a civil war, while it's, in my opinion, in reality is a proxy war. We have 74 countries contributing directly to the war in Syria, and those who are indirectly also. So anyway, so after 2011, I was in Syria, I came back, and then I had to, of course, I want to be connected. I believed in the revolution. I did something that completely, it's like one of the, there's 3 points of important or turn in my life. This is one of the biggest ones. And so I wanted to be connected, and social media was the only way. And social media all of a sudden turns so red, like very bloody, that what we see every day. And I had to take a decision of looking at these images and videos, or actually not, you know, because thinking of, shall I steer on the awfulness of the tragedy, or shall I just look away and protect my psychological and health system, because it's definitely resonated in a trauma. I remember the first video I've seen of someone who cut their, so there's a man, he was like tied to the bed or chained to the bed, and there was some doctors around him in a hospital, and all of a sudden the camera moved, and there's a plate, iron plate, and there's his feet in the plate. So they cut his feet because he destroyed a public monument of Hafiz al-Assad. He just pushed it and destroyed it. So they caught him and they cut his feet just as a punishment, that he will never can work again. That definitely, like, it was one of the very first videos I've seen, and I was in the same hospital, so I know it very well. So it affected me, I think, double. So. And that moment I had to take a decision what to see, or if I should see or not. I took the decision, I think the wrong decision, or the right decision, I don't know, that I have to see. I have to look, and I have to steer on the eye of the horrific. And that kind of created the question, how can we represent these photos? How can I show this photo? Because I posted one photo only, which it was a little bit graphical or graphic, and like several people, yeah, from mainly from the West, or actually only from the West, asked me to remove it or to take it down, because it's very graphical and it's just not so appropriate, and in their opinion, to be represented or presented. And that led me to think more about it, and how can we present, how can we also think, or how can we not ignore the pain of the victims? What if this person is my brother or sister or whatever? Do I want to see him or her for the rest of my life? This is the image, the last image I want to see of them. How can I tell their stories without you know, showing while keeping their dignity. So basically, I start working on a different method where all the time we don't see the victims, we see their traces. As I mentioned, there's a, for example, there's a 55,000 photograph leaked out of Syria, of a jail. A photographer, very famous, or he now become famous, called Caesar. It's called Caesar photography, Caesar photos, those who doesn't know it. So a photographer who used to work in the army was assigned a task to document the death of prisoners in jail. And so they arrest people in the street, they take them to jail, they torture them until they die. And then for some reason, which I don't understand until today, the regime decided to document these events, and where these photos now become one of the strongest evidence against Assad regime. So basically what this photographer did, he took 5 photographs of each dead body, right? So imagine like 11,000 bodies, right? And after 2 years, he couldn't take it anymore. So he smuggled his family out of the country, then he smuggled himself with the photos. And the photos are very, very, very graphic, right? It's as graphic as Holocaust photos. I I invite you to watch it, to see it, but I don't invite you to see it as well. So what they did in these photos, they completely dehumanize even the victims. So they are most of the time naked, very very thin, because obviously they haven't eaten since, or they didn't feed them good, and they put tape on their front head, on their chest, and they write number of the body and the department where the person was killed. So, and imagine you have to deal all of a sudden with 55,000 photographs of such. So how can I tell you the story? How can I bring the story to platforms where these need to be talking about it? And that's what I meant as well, Janina. This is where we make advocacy as well, because I think if Assad did nothing, only did this crime, it's enough. Like it's enough to him and like all his regime to be taken to the international court. So basically what I did, I took the metadata of the photos and I put tape on the paper, and I just wrote the metadata of the photo. So all of a sudden there's an absence of the victims, but there's a traces. So I'm emphasizing, highlighting the absence by or making highlighting their presence by their absence. So they become more like an abstract idea, or more not abstract, they become more metaphoric of the victim in general. And I repeat this in different, maybe later on I will talk about other projects also to leave space for Kara and Janina to contribute to the conversation.
I think these are very relevant questions that also were brought up by Janina before, when she said that the program is kind of a care work, or it has to do with care. And you all talked about the problematics of exhibiting, of archiving, of repeating possible and in a problematic way trauma, of preventing trauma. And I think all of you, as far as I see it, agree on complicating futurity, in that it is not something that's linear, following from what it is now. And I want to come back to what Janina said, and also to what you said before this panel, that you were a bit skeptical of thinking love and the future together. And I thought about it, and maybe you want to say more about it. And I think, and I imagine it touches also the question that talking about the future is always related to power. I mean, who has a future? Who can envision a future? Who is a future, or in what way the future is envisioned, in what way? I could imagine that Kara has a lot to say to that topic too, but maybe Janina, you want to start on your talk a bit about your skepticism on talking about the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, Jota Mombasa, what I mentioned previously as one of the reference, she's a Brazilian artist. It's not just, and a friend, and she has is a visual artist, but also she's now making films. And then she writes too, and she has a very profound work with Octavia Butler's books. And she has a very short essay that's it's called Lowering Lamina and I at the gates of the end of the world. So, I won't go deeper on that. Maybe I can explore, but it's basically the idea that if we're living, the end of the world is not bad. Basically, this is the idea. It has to do with also mountains and having a thinkings on the commons. That's running. Fugitivity is not the end, but the process. So, and if the world is ending, and it's a kind of course, it's bad, but it's bad. It's always been bad for us. That's, a thing, just, to think about the relationship, about trauma and everything, in a way that she talks about this kind of life pessimism. So that's also, so for those who are not, in power, who I'm not talking about only, money power, but about symbolic power, about, hegemonic power in different levels. This is the end, the world that is ending. That's also related to Denise Ferreira da Silva's reflection. So, and she's been saying this for a while. We've been living the end of the world, as you know. We are living the end of this epistemological and economical place built during modern times. So Cara also approached this on her work, so she speaks better than me. But in that sense, when Jota speaks about this life pessimism, it's just kind of framed differently. And I do believe that Cara does that on her work too, frame different what we're living, because the only possibility for I'm not talking about subjects because I don't like this. I have to, it's different, it's tricky with the word, but let's talk about people, let's talk about presence is the more, if we're talking about our presence in the world, this pretty much the only opportunity to do something. It's once we recognize capitalism is ruining this ontological and epistemological place of the modern subject, it's not working at all. It's not good for it. So once we recognize this, it's also a way to move forward. So I'm not skeptical. I'm just kind of, let's put this way, frame like life pessimist, to quote my friend Jota. Anyway, but what I was saying is that it's, I'm not alone. I'm with all the people in my country. It's a very hard time, not only about the pandemics, but all the political situation. We are living this genocide plan because there's many ways, as I said, there's many ways of portray trauma. Also, there's many ways to perpetuate genocide, to perpetrate genocide. One of them is doing nothing. That's what's happening now here in Brazil with pandemics. So once the government has no plan at all, people are still dying and they're gonna keep on dying. And, I think there was this, I stopped reading the news, but there was this article saying that Brazil was the worst place in the world in fighting COVID. So, this is not by chance, this is a plan. It's a genocide plan. So that's, talking about future, having future as something that is given is a privilege. Future is something for those who are not in power. You have to create, you have to fabulate on that, because we are not bound to survive. We're not bound to, we're not supposed to be there doing things. So to talk about future and to connect that with love, that's why I'm not skeptical, because that I've been doing this. I'm trying to create futures and possibilities. That's how I like to think about my work too. Also, and yes, to talk about future requires, it demands something from you, just like, understanding your place in the world and, and thinking about time in another way that's not this linear time. It's more kind of spiral time, as Leda Maria Martins says. It's a Brazilian intellectual and someone that comes from the world of performance and theater, but also pretty much connect to Afro-Brazilian cultures and religions. So it's also to frame things in a different, really other epistemological perspective. That's what, for me, it makes possible to think about the future. Because if you tell me that we are going to think about the future in this frame that we have now, historically, I'm not talking about 2021, I'm talking about the whole modern history. You know, that's no future. That was not supposed to be future for us. I mean, us. And that's how I was, you know, saying that it's challenging, because that's the displacement that you have to do. You have to use other tools to think about what you're living in order to find futurity as a possibility. I don't know. Something like that.
Thank you so
Maybe
much.
Karaki will help me on
Yes,
that.
I would love to hear a response from your side, especially since Janaina brought up fabulation and the creation of futurity as an epistemological work, and I think that resonates strongly with your work. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely, you know, I've thought, I mean, there's so many rich things in this conversation already. So I maybe we'll just sort of start by saying one of the places that that my book Queer Times, Black Futures begins is with this notion that it's after the end of the world, right? Which is a way of acknowledging, I think, that for some groups of people, and in particular for diasporic Africans who were, you know, forced into chattel slavery, that marked the end of a world, right? And so the living that we're doing is kind of already after the end of the world. And what does it mean then to start from this after the end of the world place? Because, you know, I mean, part of what I've been working with in that book also is the notion of Afrofuturism. And the way I started thinking about it was just by thinking about, okay, Afrofuturism actually imagines a future with Black people, which if you look at like science fiction, you look at speculative fiction, sort of mainstream at that time, most of the imaginations of futures did not include Black people. So there was a kind of way in which the future as it was imagined actually was imagined you know, as a future without Black people, and Afrofuturism put Black people in the future, which was sort of where I started kind of thinking about that as a provocation. And the more that I thought about it, the more I really began to understand as well the imbrication of the future with notions of futures, which has a kind of economic valence to it. So we have like futures trading, or, you know, like the notion of futures contracts and the way that those futures are pinned to the perpetuation of the existing relations, or the world as it exists now. And I became more and more drawn to formulations of futures that actually broke with the way that things are now in the hegemonic sense, but also understanding that we are building those futures. Like we are kind of in the process of living those futures that may not look like futures to the kind of, you know, power structure, right? So one of the things I thought about was like, you know, from that perspective of the existing notion of future, Black futures looks like no future at all. Right? But there's a way too that I think that, you know, one of the things I think I said, I like making future love tonight, right? Because the notion of making future love tonight is part of what I think, you know, I'm trying to sort of uncover, right? That there's a way in which that kind of temporality of the now also contains all of these futures in it, and that some of those futures are still there in every moment, even if they're not the future that had become the present. So I'll try to explain that, because I feel like it was a little convoluted. There's a book by Gary Wilder that's about Césaire and Glissant, and it's a book in which Wilder talks about how the futures that were imagined by these like anti-colonial activists, in a certain moment, those futures never came to be. But there's still a way in which we can perceive them now as still part of our present. And so it's also this idea that that what we're doing, even if it doesn't become, and this is the consequence part, even if it doesn't become immediately consequential, right? It's still never lost. It's still like these efforts that we're making, the things that we're improvising, and the worlds that we're trying to live and feel now, that are the worlds that we want to live in, even if it's not the world that we're living in as a shared reality. There's still, I think, these pockets in which we can live and feel this other world, this other future that we're building, and those efforts, those futures are never really lost. So I guess I kind of maybe got myself a little off track here in terms of tracing the discussion thread, but I do think that that for me, thinking through the different investments in futures and in the future, and thinking about what it would mean to say that what we have is now, what we have is what's right in front of us, which I think also references the earlier talk that I heard, right? There's a way in which the efforts that we're making to anchor something different are also, drawing on futures past that perhaps never came to be, but also making little seeds, dropping little seeds of futures for ourselves, but also for others.
Would you also say that your work is part of nurturing this seed of futurity in the here and now?
I mean, ideally, I would love to claim that, but part of it is to say,
yes,
too.
It is.
Well, I appreciate that. I do think, part of it is to acknowledge that we don't, that there's a space in which we don't know what, and to be trying to trying to pay more attention, I guess, to the means, to like the way that I'm doing what I'm doing, the kinds of epistemologies that I'm wanting to bring into conversation, and to do that without being programmatic about it, and knowing that it's going to have the effect that I want. It's almost like doing with that. It's like acting, rooting a kind of acting as though I already inhabited that world, even when I know I don't already, but also trying to engage with the world that is a shared world, more commonly shared. So I would hope, I mean, my hope is always, that it does become generative for others, and once I throw something out there into the world, I can't control what happens to it, but I can try to do my best as I'm writing, as I'm thinking, to open space for other kinds of knowledges and etc.
I think you already said two very important things. I just want to underline, and from what you said, I got that you perceive also Afrofuturist art and film not only as an imagination, but as a technique of making a future, of opening up a future, starting from the here and now. And I think this is also very important that it's not just imagination of a faraway future, but listening and seeing, starting from the situatedness of the here and now, and then unfold or nurture the seed, as you talked about, of a potentiality. That's what or virtuality in very different terms from what I get. I think that is also very, very important in terms of consequence, but because it is a very different notion of thinking consequence, not just realizing a political ideal, but really needs maybe other techniques of being rigorous, or of thinking about coherence in a totally different way, not just like having a political idea and then realizing it, but it needs other techniques.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, what I heard Khalid explain about his own sort of projects, like there's a way that I understand that kind of space, the making space for things to happen without saying this is what's going to happen in my space, right? I understand that to be a similar kind of gesture and a similar way of thinking about this, a technique, as you said, for opening up possibilities.
You want to answer to that, or Janaina also wanted to answer before from what I saw from your gestures?
No, I'll just a quick add. I was thinking what Kara was saying, that also it plays action in a different, way. So it's a different way of, and when you assume that future is not necessarily, the future that was imagined and didn't happen is not lost. It's somehow here and valid. So also you're thinking action in a different way. And for extension, thinking consequences and taking consequences in a different way. It depends who is taking those consequences. And of course, we can't miss that, point, because we are not, this is also a thing to think about singularity, because we are talking about, of course, violence and trauma, but the other side of, or not the other side, let's not go this one side or the other, but other possibility of thinking of it's about freedom. So because sometimes it takes so hard and trauma and violence that, because also what we are fighting for is somehow a freedom of those chains that keep us attached to this experience and this only possibility of action or dreaming or being or existing on screens or in life in general. I don't know, just thinking out loud, inspired by Kara.
Yeah.
Kala's.
Yeah, I just want also to add to what you were saying, Janina. I completely agree with you also in terms of like, can we as maybe not so can we imagine or can we plan the future? For me / us, it's a little bit hard, since we don't have the power, since we don't have the control. We can live the future that other people is creating. Right now, what's happening in Silicon Valley, for example, not to mention the West or the white institutions in a bigger sense, the white male straight white institutions in particular. Let's not even talk about this. Let's talk only that actually plan our future, right? And what we have left, we have the only thing to do is to live it. Like either we live it or not. Like we don't have a space even to be part of planning it or imagining it. And I think what I like about the virus, about the pandemic, and there's of course nothing to like about it, but to like about the consequences or the situation that was around it, is actually it's put us all in this urgency situation where we have to think in intersectional way. We have to think in this horizontal solidarity. We have to think of leaving no one behind. We have to think on collective healing, because it's proven again by the virus that if we don't plan the future all together, and it's not metaphorically anymore, we all gonna be screwed, like proven by now, right? And the death in the state is high number, it's crazy. And even with the state being the biggest capitalistic country and leading the world, whatever that means, but it's still kind of screwed to this point. And I think there should be also another way of thinking of how the inclusivity, how can we all together understanding this, we all in the same boat, how can we reach the next shore? I think that's very important, just as a, yeah, I want to comment on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would definitely agree with that and say that for me, that's part of what I'm talking about. Not necessarily that, that we're going to be invited into that planning of the future, but that it's part of the actions that we're all kind of taking. Is that consistent with what you were saying?
Yeah, totally.
I think one thing I found very important in what you were saying right now is that you pointed to perceiving problems in a complex way and in an intersectional way, for example. And also there was one thing I was thinking to prepare this panel, and this was also perception of consequence, and this has two dimensions, I guess. We all are trained by neoliberalism to not face certain consequences, not we all, but neoliberalism trains people, at least those who live in privileges, to externalize consequences, right, of our actions. And on the other side, the perception of things changing and the possibility to change has to be, there's a lot of cultural work in this to make perceivable that things can change somehow. And I think it's also very important in terms of empowerment of oneself and others to make change perceivable. And this has a lot to do, I think, with consequences also, because as you said, that a lot of problems right now are entangled and people feel overwhelmingly not in a position to react to one single problem without maybe not responding to others, which makes political work extremely complex and problems entangled with each other. For example, ecological problems with problems of colonization and racism and so on. So I think also this notion of consequences very much related to perception. On the one side, what can be made perceptible, and on the other side, how can people in the positive way experience consequences. So any ideas on that?
I mean, I'd love to hear a little bit more about the idea of the, I think the sort of notion of traces, or like looking after, what's looking after sort of the victims of violence, for example, which is to me sort of like a form of care. And I think I don't want to speak for you, but I'd ask you, how you sort of think about that in your practice, right? In relationship to that question.
Yeah. It's actually something recently, or like lately, I discovered that, because I try to draw a line in connection to all what I'm doing, and because I'm doing a lot of different things, and sometimes I get lost with myself, with what I'm doing, overwhelmed, and I can overwhelm anyone when I start talking about 1 million project and here and there, and like all of a sudden this and this and that. But I noticed that I worked a lot with absence, the idea of absence in general, because I think this is, so first of all, I had also to change a little bit my line of thinking, my way of production, the aesthetic I'm using, understanding that I'm now located in Europe. My audience are different. I want to speak the same artistic language aesthetically. I want to produce something to channel stories to people here, to a language that they can understand. So I changed completely the aesthetic or the tactics even, or the strategy even that I use to in my work, where absence become kind of the all the time the main tool I use. So basically, to give an example or be more precise with, for example, we're hosting an exhibition end of April, and now it's pandemic. No one can visit the exhibition, etc. And it's 6 female artists, and I hate that I have to add female, because all the time when we say 6 artists, we all the time think, you know, it's a but with 6 female artists, and they all from Middle East. They live in Germany in different cities, and we have actually worked with them together with the program here called Artist Training, and specifically for artists in exile, supporting them at the beginning of their career in Germany. And we were forming a temporary collective. They have the desire to work on the concept of absence, which I found it perfect fitting, and because it's like a topic that matters for me. And we decided at the end to actually host the exhibition during the pandemic, and present the absence, or it was the idea, can we present absence in the present? And that kind of led us to think, let's actually have an exhibition where the audience are absence, the artwork is absence, and the artists are absence as well. Or is that possible at all? So what we actually doing, we're installing 6 printers in the space in a specific kind of aesthetic installation. The artists, they have already started working on their work, which is basically documenting their life under the pandemic, where everything is absence, from sometimes beloved ones to people around us, to everything is absence now. And it can be anything, right? So it can be drawing, screenshots, photography, artwork, image, anything, suicidal thoughts, anything they want, because they will not sign it with their names. And each of them will making around 200 paper, and the exhibition will be open 1 week, 5 minutes every day. So the artwork will all of a sudden arrive to the space, be printed, right? And it will be documented as well and presented 5 minutes, as I mentioned. So what I was trying to say, I think, with this example, that how can we all the time, without necessarily presenting on your face kind of necessary work or topic or conflicts, or in a more indirect way. And I think this is the power that only art has, or art and cinema, but other, of course, like art in a bigger sense, of course. While, for example, as we were talking about in journalism, you have to do something, or like it's a completely different strategy and tactics as well, because it's connected more similar to documentary film, that's connected more to to reality or to facts. Yeah, so this is in general, I think another example as well, that in front of Copland, since you mentioned this, Julia, as well, it's a recent work or recent installation I did in front of the High Court in Copland, where 2 Syrian men charged of human rights violation. They arrived to Germany 2014. And the victims or members of the families of the victims, they discovered that they're here, they report them, and there was a file or trial against them. And it was during the first lockdown. A lot of us were thinking, us as Syrians in the sense, were thinking or specifically actually the victims or their families, they wanted to be part of this trial, to understand what's happening. It's trial against it's Syrian men against, or like the trial is against Syrian men, and it belongs to them. And it was impossible. First of all, the court was holding in German, which they don't understand sometimes the language. The second thing was it's a pandemic and it's not allowed to demonstrate. So basically what I did, I collected clothes of Syrian activists living in diaspora, and like formed the shape of their bodies, and I put them in mannequins, and trying to kind of mimic the shape of their bodies. And we installed 49 of these figures in front of the court while it was happening inside, and I like chopped the heads of the mannequins and reverse it so that the head is looking inside, and the neck kind of, it becomes almost like a horn and a voice. So while you try to mute people, they become even louder. And these two men, they were like passing by the police in the police car and looking at the demonstration of no one, but it's, I think, resembling the first moment of going to the street to demonstrate, of activist work and what they did, and kind of at the same time creating alternative courts, so you can hear what's happening inside. Or we want to make a statement that we are here, it's our court, we want to know what's happening, giving platforms as well to NGOs or initiatives, one called Families for Freedom. It's an amazing initiative led by women who actually suffer forceful disappearance in jail until today. And a lot of people, they don't know where their family members, so they form this initiative. Another initiative, what I mentioned before, the Caesar families photos, the Caesar photos. So now there's a Caesar association, or family association, where all the people who found out their children or family members were killed by these photos. And imagine how horrible it is to the families, right? Because, so just a little bit background. When the regime kidnapped someone from the street, like one of these two men who were in charge was, that was his main job. They put them in jail, and you don't know if they're still alive, if they are killed. You have no clue about, and you can't have access to the information. And then a lot of people, they have to go through 55,000 people who still have members in the jail of Assad. They have to go through all these photos to see, is my child is there, or is my brother there? So just imagine this mental process you have, a psychological process and emotional you have to go through. Anyway, so I invited them to become part of this installation. They arrived with the photos of their missing loved ones, and they also install it. They were installing it every week or every second week when the trial was happening or the court was happening. And in front of the court, they were bringing these photos, and they brought it and they hold it also as part of the installation as well, creating alternative court where you can actually hear their stories. Because what we don't hear in the legal system all the time, the emotional stories of the victims, it's not considered, right? One which I find it a little bit, of course, not problematic. It's a legal case at the end, and you have to prove with everything. But the missing part is the personal stories, because in the court, it's almost like a theater, the court, right? Everyone play by script, even by customs, like everything, and light, and everyone entering, and you ask question, you answer the question with no emotions. So there's no place for giving any consideration for the victims themselves or their stories. And that's what we try to do. So we build kind of this cooperation outside ourselves, or like in the studio, also understanding again the intersectionality between art and activism. Actually, the work was very well received internationally and brought more attention to the cause, and specifically as well to, I think for us as Syrian was very important. All of a sudden we can speak the law language, or it brought the law language to everyone, because before, what's happening inside the courts, like what's happening inside jails, right? We don't know about it unless if we experience it. So it's something, it's another universe. We don't swim in the same universe at all. And all of a sudden people start adopting the words and understanding the situation that actually, which was part of also or examples of the work. Again, I don't want to talk a lot, and I know I have the temptation to. I can go forever, so I will stop now, because I think we also very close to the end of the session. So yeah, back to you, Julia.
Can I just ask one thing?
Sure, please do. Yes,
no,
sure.
First, thank you so much, Karen, for sharing, such a, rich and inspiring, ways of doing things and think about things. Just one doubt, when you meant the first project on absence, that's no, that I love it, by the way. And there's also no authorship. So how it's just the things were arriving at the same times, and you don't know who is doing what, and how was the reception of that? You know, I was curious.
So we haven't done the exhibition. It will happen
it's
in April, end of April.
It's end of April.
Yeah, but so just also, I mean, first of all, the work itself, it belongs to the artist. Each artist, they own their own work. We never, as an institution, at our curator or whatever, will never, ever, ever. But also what we agreed on, that they want to be presented as a collective, even it's a temporary pop-up collective, right? So they want in this project to be absence, like as their personality. I mean, they are not absence, their names is there. I believe you will kind of maybe know sometimes which artist is doing what, but I prefer, I hope, I prefer nothing. I think me as a I don't want to say as a curator, even as a audience, I would like not to know, and like going through a lot of crazy thoughts and whatever, or drawings or whatever they are doing, and not knowing. I think that will be even more interesting. But yeah, we kind of have some systematic way of doing this by adding the time and dates by the end of each page, so the pages will be ordered, or they will be in the order of the time and the date, so you will not really know who's doing what, which is the aim of
yes, I thought it was.
Last thing I want to mention, and sorry, Julia, to now steal this to a moment to advertise for our conference. We are hosting on the 21st and to 27th, the third week of March, a conference around the relation between politics and art, the street and the institution. And we inviting every day different people. I mean, we want it also to be a Syrian dialogue, because all the time we invited to panels, but we don't create or design our panels. So we decided to bring many people. So yeah, please be part of it if you want. A mute will be installed in front of the Bundestag on the 15th as well. And sorry to take this moment to make PR for our project, but yeah, we'd love to see some of the audience as well there.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's really fascinating how, like, also in the description you interweave like healing and facilitating social processes and the politics of making visible that I was asked for. I have one question. Maybe we can quickly take that to Kara and Janaina, because I got it from the Telegram chat. And Petra is asking that we need to talk about the history as well, and coming back to the interwovenness of present, future, and the history, and to avoid to confront and we can't avoid to confront the traumas. How can we approach the history from the future perspective? I think it's maybe more question to Janaina and Kara, but maybe to all of you if you want to respond. I mean, we touched on this already a bit, but maybe this is a question that is asked more concrete.
I think, you know, everything Caleb describes pretty much that, how we do, just like by doing. And I think, you know, to relate to the things that we've been talking, you know, like taking consequences and actions. And I think it's not to lose this perspective, how implicated things are, and displacement from your privileged place and space is urgent in terms of creating different possibilities of coexistence in the world, because so far it's not working, you know. So I think it's pretty much like this, you know, just like I think this, when you talk about future and making future love tonight, I think has to do with, you know, the shift with, you know, we talk about love, but to get there, I think we have to be a little bit, you know, not so comfortable in the place we are, to understand, because it's not possible to talk about love if other people are dying, suffering, you know. So we have to be find this place of connection and the place of a possible place where if not, we are all good. So maybe we are all uncomfortable together. I don't know. It's like, to change a little bit. So that's how I think the way for me, where I'm trying to think about history and not perpetuate trauma, because trauma is not going to stop existing, So if I'm more interested in not updating, expanding in every action and everything I'm doing, and also create room from other things that not related directly to trauma, because we are not only trauma. Trauma is part, like Fred Moten says in Arthur Jafa's films, can blackness be love? We are not only, of course we are related to trauma, but we are not only trauma, we go beyond trauma, and we are doing, such, I'm so impressed with everything Caleb I say, so I'm a little bit I lost, but I think this is it, just the way of approaching, is not losing this perspective somehow.
I think, I would say, like, to me, there are different kinds of love, right? Like, there's we know a lot of different kinds of love from pop music, for example, right? There's love that's there's love that's not love. There's to me, there's a lot of different ways of thinking about what love, what that encompasses. But I think that it is sort of something that has to be anchored in a present, and that the injunction and the possibility of love, even in the face of all of the catastrophes of the world, that there's something kind of to that. In terms of, I've learned a lot, from Saidiya Hartman's latest work on Wayward Lives. I forget the whole title, but it's a book that is a book of history. But part of what she does is she'll look at sort of historical documents, for example, a photograph that was perhaps used for a certain purpose at a certain moment. So a photograph of a young Black girl, for example, that was probably taken and for a kind of sociological study of the Black problem, right? So there's a way that photograph was taken, it's framed in a certain way, it served a certain purpose historically, and that purpose is actually to undermine and obfuscate the richness of this girl's existence. And what Saidiya Hartman does is she goes into that, she reads that photograph in a different way by bringing a richer historical context to bear on it, to think about what the lives of Black people were during the 1920s and what this photograph actually is kind of hiding in some ways. And so I think there's a way that there's a kind of mode of historiography that is Saidiya Hartman will talk about critical fabulation, and people have been doing that kind of work with history. But I also think there's a way of sitting with the sort of richness of the past, as I said earlier, that is about kind of also a project that's anchored in the present, but that has to do with the production of different possible futures. And to me, however we think about love, it's a very complicated thing, right? But love, care, those things that might actually sort of nurture different possibilities. To me, those are really still key, even if we're also uncomfortable. Can Blackness be loved? To me, is a question about can love still be generated in the context of all that, all of the richness of Blackness, including the trauma, but not only the trauma, that love can sort of be generated because of that place, but also for that place, and that's a kind of, you know, challenge of living of living during catastrophic times, you know.
Thank you for also giving us this perspective at the end of this discussion. I don't want to add anything, just to thank you, all of you, for this rich insights, for engaging with each other's work and thinking through it and appreciating and valuing it. This was really great having you, and I would love to continue this discussion, but the host started to mute me to sign that I have to end this discussion. So I will just to take this opportunity to thank you, Jana, Ina, Karen, Khaled, and also the audiences, and also Critics Week to make this possible. And I wish all of you a great week of screenings and hope to see you soon, and maybe very soon in the Gaza this evening. To all those attending the conference, have a very good night and afternoon wherever you are, and yes, see you soon.
Thank you, Julia.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Ciao. Bye.
Nice to meet you all. Ciao.
Thank you very much for this talk, for your thoughts. I hope you're still there to listen. I think it was a wonderful final of our conference, and I would have loved to listen more as well. But yeah, I think there were already a lot of lines to follow in our thoughts. And yes, now thank you very much for listening also to this whole conference. I'm just here to say that in the following week, we have every day another debate with wonderful guests. Tomorrow we are starting with a debate about facing traces with Francina Carbonell, Sunay Samskiri, Volker Pantenburg, and Ruth Beckermann. And we are talking also about cinematic traces and how to follow them. So it really is connected to this last panel. And yeah, it would be wonderful if you join us there as well. And you could see the 2 films related to the debate tomorrow online, as well as all the other films. So again, thank you very much for joining, for listening, and hope to see you soon.